Hey everybody. Well, it's that time of year again. Time to talk about our favorite and least favorite films this year because that's what we're all talking about this January, right? Nothing else big going on? Who am I kidding? But before we get into the list, I want to acknowledge that I didn't exactly go to the movies for everything that came out this year, so I'm not going to be including some films like The Brutalist, Sing Sing, The Piano Lesson, Transformers 1, Challengers, or I'm Still Here. I did notice that A Real Pain is currently on Hulu right now, so I'm going to be taking a look at that later today. But for right now, I feel pretty comfortable knowing that I've seen enough films to conclude my list here. So let's just cut to the chase and get right to the list. Sit back, grab yourself a drink, and let's get started.
Number 10, Lisa Frankenstein. The moment I saw the poster for this, never having seen the trailer, I knew this film had caught my attention. Little did I know I was in for a cult film that was a solid throwback to other 80s cult films like Heathers, Reanimator, and Weird Science, with a dash of Tim Burton thrown in. The movie follows Lisa Swallows, a trauma victim who forms a relationship with a Victorian era zombie that she slowly helps put back together, using the best parts of the worst people around her. The look and feel of this movie is like one of those 80s time capsules you'd browse by at Blockbuster. Diablo Cody and Zelda Williams clearly have a love for this kind of style, from the high school setting to the look and feel of the town, and especially the graveyard and the costumes. Catherine Newton and Cole Sprouse are absolutely electric on screen, and I love how Newton plays Lisa very reserved, but as the film goes on, you finally see her embrace those vengeful impulses so deliciously. Sprouse almost has no lines in the entire film, so most of his work comes through his body language and visual comedy. I guess working with Adam Sandler as a kid certainly paid off. If you're looking for a fun film to put on during the Halloween season, add Lisa Frankenstein to the list, especially if you want to keep your happy hand attached. Number 9, Furiosa, a Mad Max saga. I absolutely loved Mad Max Fury Road, and while it's certain that we'll never get to see another Mad Max film from George Miller again, considering his age and so forth, I was happy he was able to give us one last movie following the best character from Fury Road, Furiosa. Once again, the look of this film is striking, as every shot and frame feels like something you'd see in a museum gallery. The colors, the lighting, the set texture just screams apocalypse, but it's hard to look away from it. Not only does George Miller still know how to make a damn good action movie, he and his team know how to make it look strikingly memorable. Speaking of action scenes, this movie is just as intense and as violent as its predecessor, although seeing it in 4DX might have messed up my back a little bit. Anya Taylor-Joy is spectacular as Furiosa and is a great successor to Charlize Theron. Chris Hemsworth is deliciously evil as Dementus, even if he is no Immortan Joe. If you missed your chance to see this in theaters like almost everybody else did, then don't miss your chance to get the Blu-ray and watch it at home. Hell, I recommend doing this as a back-to-back double feature with Fury Road because it just goes into it seamlessly. Number 8, Hundreds of Beavers. Have you ever wanted to see a movie that's a love letter to Looney Tunes, Mario Brothers, and silent films? Well, look no further than Hundreds of Beavers. The movie is about Jean Kayak, an Applejack salesman who loses everything and resorts to becoming a fur trapper to win the heart of the merchant's daughter. While obviously a tribute to silent film era stars like Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin, it's also reminiscent of the early days of Sam Raimi with a touch of modern Wes Anderson, being that it's a very cartoonishly silly movie that has a charming sense of likability to it. This is the kind of movie that everybody's inner child wishes that they made. Something that was very silly beyond belief, but the commitment and dedication is what truly makes it land best. I especially love how every single animal in this movie is just a guy in a suit, from the beavers to rabbits to the wolves and even beavers dressed up as Sherlock Holmes and Watson. Mike Cheslick had a vision and he was committed to making it. I can't thank him enough for making a movie that provided nothing but laughs in these dark times. If the first 10 minutes doesn't have you laughing hysterically, then this probably isn't going to be for you. But if it does get you laughing, then sit back and enjoy the fun ride. It should be free on YouTube as I'm recording this, so I don't know if you have any other excuse to avoid it. Number 7, Superman, the Christopher Reeve story. For anyone who's grown up with the pre-Snyder Superman films, you should know who Christopher Reeve was. The difference with this documentary is it's through the perspective of his children and how his accident took a massive toll on them as a family. Heck, his youngest son was only 2 or 3 years old when the accident happened, and having lost his parents before he was even in high school, I can't imagine how traumatizing that must have been for him. The movie establishes that Reeve obviously was not a perfect man, as he tried to establish outside of his Superman roles, but he was still somebody who understood what it meant to give people an idol like that to look up to, especially as a father. His journey after his injury gave people hope, showing that being paralyzed wasn't the end of the world like they all thought, and that with the right amount of dedication and connecting with people, they could still make a difference for the better. This was a very clear reminder not only to the kind of man that Christopher Reeve was to friends and family, but also a reminder of what it meant to be playing a character like Superman for a lot of general audiences. Reeve set a standard for heroes even if it wasn't his initial goal in life. God bless him, and may he and Dana rest in peace. Number 6, Inside Out 2. Inside Out is my favorite movie of all time. I've made no secret about it. So I had a lot of high expectations with Inside Out 2, and thankfully it does its predecessor justice. The movie shows Riley going through another big change in life, puberty, and the new emotions that come with it. This obviously leads to anxiety taking over her whole mood. I have to say, this movie gave me some of the biggest laughs I've had all year, especially when it came to Pouchy, but it also gave me some of the most heartfelt moments I've had all year. My biggest concern with this movie was whether or not it was going to recapture the same level of maturity about mental illness just as the first movie did. Thankfully, it does, and I would say it's the best written Pixar sequel we've gotten since Toy Story 3. Hell, the details that they went into with the cinematography were especially top-notch. Not to mention, when I finally started going to therapy this year, this movie came at just the right time when I needed reassurance the most, through Riley's struggle of whether she's good enough to play hockey or deserve friends. Just as a quick spoiler and a bit of a warning, the panic attack that they established did kind of trigger me, so if you do have anxiety, I still recommend it, but proceed with caution. At the end of the day, Inside Out 2 is a damn good sequel, and I highly recommend it for anyone of all ages. Number 5, The Wild Robot. After Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, I wasn't really expecting DreamWorks to deliver that kind of quality again, and color me surprised, within 2 years, with their last in-house production, Chris Sanders and his team went out on a fucking high note. This is one of the most beautiful looking movies I have ever seen. With the animation being so top-notch, it's hard to think of a film that felt more like a work of art than this one, at least in terms of the CG animated movies this year. I was enthralled with the relationship between Roz and Brightbill, and Fink was actually more likable than I expected him to be. The score by Chris Bowers is enchanting to say the least, and the voice acting, especially from Lupita Nyong'o as Roz, is some of the best that the studio put out. While Inside Out does have the better script, The Wild Robot had the better experience, especially in the animation. The watercolors just really stood out to me, and honestly, if this does end up getting a sequel, then I just pray that they put the same amount of effort that they did for this film. Number 4, Dune Part 2. Denis Villeneuve has had uphill battles with every film since Prisoners, but it's easy to say that Dune is his magnum opus. Dune Part 1 was the appetizer, and now it's time for Dune Part 2 to be the entree. This is one of the biggest films I've seen this year, and they make the most of it in every aspect. The action scenes, the worm riding, everything about this movie just captures the epic scale and wonder that Frank Herbert's novel was best known for, encapsulating all of that majesty and sci-fi imagination. This is the kind of movie that benefits from the theatrical experience, with its jaw-dropping cinematography and powerful score. It sucks that the Academy is snubbing Hans Zimmer this year, but I'm at least glad that the first film got him his Oscar for Best Original Score. Timothée Chalamet proved he was Paul Atreides, especially when he was finally demonstrating his voice. Austin Butler as Freyd Rutha was truly an animal, and the duel between him and Paul was one of the best choreographed fight scenes of the year. If you need any other reason to watch Dune Part 2, I suggest you get walking. Castillo controls the spice. Controls Dune's popularity. Number 3, Wicked. If you had told me 10 years ago that the director of Gem and the Holograms was going to make a Wicked movie, I wouldn't have any faith in that project at all. However, John M. Chu has only been improving, and after this and In the Heights, he's come around as being a solid filmmaker. While the trend of sympathetic villain origins has gotten tiresome, Wicked was one of the first to do so successfully in books and on stage, and the film does an excellent job in recapturing that magic. While the decision of splitting it into 2 films was eye-rolling at first, it ended up being a good choice to give this the epic presentation that it truly deserves. Almost everyone gets a moment to shine, and the story is still satisfying enough to where I didn't feel like we were losing anything. It works on its own as a great companion piece to The Wizard of Oz, but it does make me excited to see what will come of Part 2. Cynthia Erivo once again gives an Oscar-worthy performance, and I honestly can't think of anyone else who deserves it more than her this year. Her rendition of Defying Gravity was really fucking good. Ariana Grande was surprisingly decent as Glinda, proving she understood the assignment, even demanding that Popular was kept the way it was instead of turning it into a prissy pop song. although she may end up being the next Helena Bonham Carter, and not in a good way. My only real complaint is that Michelle Yeoh doesn't exactly have a good singing voice, so her small number felt out of place. I love Michelle, but it's hard to overlook that. I love the movie more and more each time I rewatch it, so if you want to defy gravity, give a few hours to Wicked and have yourself a great time. Number 2, The Substance. If there is one movie that gave me the biggest reaction all year, it was easily this. Coralie Fargeat, the writer, director, producer, and editor, shows us just how big of an influence John Carpenter, David Lynch, and David Cronenberg were on her, and I definitely see her as one of the next horror visionaries of this generation. Demi Moore plays Elizabeth Sparkle, a former A-lister turned exercise show host who was then recommended an experimental drug called The Substance, which allows her to birth a new version of herself, younger and prettier, named Sue, played by Margaret Qualley. This was a hell of a lot gorier than I was expecting, and boy did it kick my ass with how disturbing it got. The slow progression in that addiction for attention and how it just eats away at whatever time you have left made this one of the most effective experiences I have had with a movie in a long time. Like, I was literally hugging my knees as I was sitting in the chair. It was that disturbing. Demi Moore and Margaret Qualley are so damn good as Elizabeth and Sue. When these two finally have conflict, it is hard to watch, yet harder not to watch. And the ending, when that addiction finally gets to a desperate point, ooh boy does it get wild. And Dennis Quaid as the horny producer Harvey is disgustingly over the top, but it feels kinda right with the world that this movie creates. Although I have to admit, it has turned me off of shrimp for a good long while. But if you're in the mood for one of the most disturbing body horror films we've had in a long while, I highly recommend you check out The Substance.
Now, before we get to number 1, let's go over some honorable mentions that I really wanted to mention here, but couldn't find any room on the list for it.
A Different Man. Much like The Substance, we see a performer's life change drastically as he takes a drug that makes him more socially appealing, with Sebastian Stan giving one of the best performances of the year. Memoir of a Snail, a truly memorable stop-motion film about two twins struggling to survive a life of loneliness after the death of their parents. Deadpool and Wolverine, one of the most fun movies of the year with really solid jokes about Marvel and their failed setups, with a great return from Hugh Jackman as Wolverine. Heretic gave us a remarkably great performance from Hugh Grant as a hermit who has studied religion so thoroughly that he starts to make those trapped within his house question their own faith. Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes was a surprisingly deep and meaningful revival of the Andy Serkis Planet of the Apes films, where we see how society has evolved and how Caesar's views are twisted into a new generation of leaders. The most surprising thing about it is that this came from the director of the Maze Runner trilogy. Abigail was a fun take on the story of Dracula's daughter from the directors of Ready or Not, and then it got some pretty good laughs out of me, especially from Alicia Ware as Abigail. Your Monster was an awkward but at times very funny rom-com about dealing with your inner demons, with a savage ending that I loved how ballsy it went. While Alien Romulus does recycle a lot of elements from the previous films, I would still say that Fede Alvarez's entry in this franchise is the third best we've had in the franchise, going back to its horror roots. And lastly, we've got Nosferatu, Robert Eggers' magnum opus bringing to life a new version of the first illegal Dracula adaptation, with Bill Skarsgård giving another monstrously good performance, and Lily Rose Depp surprising a lot of us. And my number 1 favorite film of 2024 is I Saw the TV Glow. We've seen A24 put out coming-of-age stories and horror films in its 10-plus years of releases, so why not combine the two into one? And that's exactly what Jane Schoenbrunn gives us. The movie follows Owen and Maddie, two teenagers who bond over a young adult TV show called The Pink Opaque, only for both of them to start questioning their own reality and who they are deep inside. Ever since I saw this in theaters, this movie has stayed on my mind throughout most of the year, and it's only gotten better with each passing viewing. It's one of the most relatable and fascinating works that we have gotten all year. While the film does focus heavily on the themes of transgender discovery that Jane Schoenbrunn intended, I found a lot of the themes to also be relatable from an autistic perspective. The psychological elements about living life in what seems to be a safe environment only to be what's truly killing you started to give me thoughts about my own life, about where I still belong, and what it is I want to do with myself. I related to both Maddie and Owen's struggles on how we could all just be characters on the other side of a TV screen far away to somebody else, or how the characters are actually the reality we're supposed to be living and that our current lives are what's actually just fictional. And I gotta say, the performances by Justice Smith and Bridget Lundy Payne, along with the conversations they had about the show and life itself, had me on edge with every word that they were speaking. I guarantee some people are going to like this movie for different reasons, but having those conversations and those different perspectives is what I love about film the most. I Saw the TV Glow is certainly my favorite movie of 2024. I love the lighting, I love the framework, I love the soundtrack, I love the performances. Everything about it is just perfect.
Now, some of you may notice that the last time I did a best of the year list, I never did a worst of the year list. Is that going to repeat again this year? Oh no. I've got some beef with 2024 that I need to get out. And I have a feeling some of you are going to be pissed.